I think we all know it has a lot more to do with just being able to produce a nuclear weapon, and a lot of it centers around oil. It's not certain that this is going to be a cakewalk, and I don't think anybody ever thought it was going to be, despite many arguments to the contrary. I would say to just step back and just kind of think about this a little bit. No, nobody of consequence thought this was going to be over in 3 days. Anybody who has studied this knows that this is going to be a much longer operation and a much bigger deal than Venezuela. What the hell is going on? What's the point of doing this, and why doing it now? Well, the bottom line is that it's, again, everybody knows that it's not just about Iran.
Welcome to the Milkshakes Markets Madness podcast, where we break down complex economic ideas, like Brent Johnson's dollar milkshake theory, and bring clarity to the chaos of financial markets. So, grab a seat, and let's make sense of the madness one sip at a time. Let's dive in.
Is Iran just a pawn in a global game of 3D chess? That's what we're going to talk about this week on Milkshakes, Markets, and Madness. Because last week, as I was flying from New York City to Cape Town, South Africa, Operation Epic Fury kicked off, and I was trying very hard to keep track of everything that was going on with very spotty Wi-Fi on the plane. It's still pretty incredible that you can fly from one side of the world to the other, though, and while you're doing it, have Wi-Fi access. So from that perspective, let's call it a success. But Operation Epic Fury, I guess we would have to say that so far the jury is still out on this one. But last weekend, the Trump administration went forward with their plans as it was very well telegraphed that they were going to try to decapitate the Iranian regime and take out the leadership and, remove their ability to both, produce a nuclear weapon. But I think we all know it has a lot more to do with just being able to produce a nuclear weapon, and a lot of it centers around oil. But what I thought we would talk about this week is what is actually going on, because it is not certain that this is going to be a cakewalk. And I don't think anybody ever thought it was going to be, despite many arguments to the contrary. And so far, it hasn't just been damaging to Iran. Now, to be clear, Iran has been hit very, very hard. Both the United States and Israel, to the most part, have control of Iranian airspace and continue to hit them hard. But Iran continues to hit back and has caused, major damage in the region to both Israeli, American, as well as other Gulf state assets in the region. So far, this doesn't show any sign of abating, but while Iran cannot really win from a military standpoint, they can cause chaos for quite a while. And the markets so far, they've definitely sold off, but they haven't absolutely collapsed. There's definitely been volatility. We see here that the S&P 500 sold off and kind of broke through both the 50-day and 100-day moving average. Seems like it's headed to the 200-day moving average. The Shanghai Composite kind of flat. It pulled back a little bit, but not dramatically. The Hang Seng, it broke down fairly hard through all three major moving averages. The Nikkei pulled back after a stellar run. Euro stocks in Europe probably took it harder than anybody. It's broken down through the 50 and the 100-day moving average. It also looks like it's headed to the 200-day. The Bovespa, after an epic run, has finally rolled over. And gold, surprisingly, didn't do a whole lot. It's kind of flat last week. The euro broke down and is through all three moving averages. The yen continues to be weak despite the Bank of Japan trying to raise some rates. And the dollar finally got a bid after being, the most shorted in history. It is now, back up in the high 90s. But the real story is oil. And I don't think that's a surprise to anybody. When you get military action in the Middle East, it's not a shock to see oil going higher. But it just begs the question, with all that's going on in the world, why is this Why does the Trump regime want to do this now? We've got a midterm election year. The operation that they did in Venezuela went extremely smoothly. Now, I don't think that they expected this to go as smoothly. And I would say that all these people that are saying that, the fact that this is still going on after 7 days and it wasn't over in 2 or 3 days shows that it's an epic failure and that they didn't know what they were doing and they didn't plan very well. I would say to just step back and just kind of think about this a little bit. No, nobody of consequence thought this was going to be over in 3 days. Anybody who has studied this knows that this is going to be a much longer operation and a much bigger deal than Venezuela was going to be. If this would have been an easy operation, it would have been done decades ago. The fact that it's not easy is why it hasn't been done before then. So I guess what I would say is anybody who's telling you that the fact that this is still going on shows that it's been an epic failure and that the United States is a paper tiger, just step back and think about this logically and perhaps get another source if that's your only source that's giving you information. But it does beg the question, like, why? Why now? Why take the risk? What's going on? What's the point of it, especially with midterms coming up? And, most people are the belief that Trump doesn't want to do anything that would harm the stock market at all. But, the fact that everybody thinks he's so concerned about the stock market, yet here he is. He sent federal troops into U.S. cities. He's kidnapped a sitting president from a foreign country, and now he has launched operations in the Middle East. So it's kind of hard to sit here and say he's won't do anything that risks the markets when he's done three things that could have potential huge risks to the markets. So why? What the hell is going on? What's the point of doing this and why doing it now? Well, the bottom line is that it's, again, everybody knows that it's not just about Iran. It's also about the fact that Iran has energy and it's about a bigger competition that's going on. And the simple fact is that Iran is one of the most important squares in the biggest game of all. And that's the great power competition for global supremacy. Now, I know there's probably some people out there saying, well, Brent, this isn't a game. Real lives are at stake. People are dying. This is horrible. And listen, you have all of my sympathy. And I tend to agree with you on that. But it doesn't change the fact that the people that run the world don't see it that way. And they do see it as a big grand chessboard. And it's not just the United States that sees it this way. Countries all over the world see it this way. And Iran is a hugely important piece on the board. That's the bottom line. And so even though it is about Iran, it's also all about China. And we've talked about this many, many times, both in our writings and on this program and on other interviews. Everything right now boils down to the competition between the United States and China. So even when it's not about China, it's still about China. And this is definitely about China. Now, you've heard me and Michael Every, and listen, if you're not already, if you're new to this channel, you've not heard me talk before, and you've never heard of Michael Every, you absolutely have to talk, or you have to start following Michael Every and read everything he writes and listen to all his interviews. I was lucky enough that I said I was on my way to South Africa last week, and I was at a corporate retreat, and he was there. And so it was awesome to be able to sit there and, kind of talk about all this stuff with him and a number of other incredibly smart people while all this was going on. And, we would all be on our phones and, making phone calls and touching base and then coming back and talking to each other. But, Michael and I have talked a lot about statecraft, an overarching grand strategy. And I think all the events that are going on in Iran very much play into Michael's framework. Some people out there saying this is completely ridiculous. There's no way that this is 3D chess by Trump. Trump probably doesn't even know how to play chess, let alone be good at it. And listen, I think the point is that it doesn't matter whether it's Trump or not. This is a game that is going on. This is a big competition that's taking place, and Iran is an important piece on the chessboard, regardless of what you think about Trump. And this is it's somebody else that I think you should follow. And if you don't already, and Anas Al Haji, he's based out of Texas, but he's been in the oil business and in kind of this global macro energy space for very, very long time. I would highly recommend you start following him. I follow him. I subscribe to his Substack. I would recommend that you do the same. But he wrote a very good post yesterday or today on Twitter. I would recommend that you go and find it. And so what I've done here is kind of summarize a bunch of his thoughts, a bunch of my thoughts, a bunch of Michael's thoughts, and try to explain what's going on and why now and why Iran and what is worth the risk, especially now. Come up with this, big overarching plan. And here's the thing, it might not even be Trump's plan. And in fact, even if he is willing to carry it out, these ideas have been around for a long time. It's not like he just showed up and said, "Hey, I have this great idea." These ideas have been floated for a long time. They've been planned for a long time. He just might be the person to come along that has, enough disregard for conventional wisdom and willing to take the risk to try and implement it. And so, the slides that come next, I mean, again, this is not something that I've come up with. It's not something necessarily that Anas or Michael came up with. These things have been talked about for years by national security planners, intelligence professionals, et cetera, et cetera. And, I think, these career military and intelligence officials, they, you know, they know that this isn't going to be easy. They know that not everything will go to plan. They know that unintended consequences will happen. Again, that's why in many ways this has never been attempted before, because it is extremely, extremely risky to try. And the other thing I'd say is nobody expects it to go exactly as planned. That's why contingency plans exist in the first place, because very, very rarely do things go as planned. But essentially, what's going on is kind of this three-phase plan from a very, very big picture perspective. And if you want to just boil them down into simplified fashion, the first phase is pain, short-term pain. The second phase is the U.S. resilience and how on a relative basis it has some things that it can do that the rest of the world just can't do. And then the third thing is that after the short-term pain and after the resilience comes the potential upside. Now, we're going to walk through all three of these. And again, none of these are guaranteed to work. It doesn't necessarily mean that this is foolproof. There's nothing to say that part of it will work and the rest won't, or it's going to go exactly as planned. But this is kind of the idea of what could happen and why it might be worth taking the risk on. Now, as far as short-term pain goes, and we've talked about this many, many times. Nobody goes into a fight expecting not to get hit. And the idea that if you do get hit, that automatically means that you lose is just kind of ridiculous. If you think about it this way, think about a basketball game. And if one team beats the other team 100-65, that means they absolutely dominated them and crushed them, right? They beat them by 35 points. But it also means that on at least 30 occasions, they lost a short-term battle because the other team scored 2 points 30 different times. So, that's kind of how you have to think about this. Nobody is saying that if the U.S. tries to pull this off, it is going to go flawlessly and there won't be any pain along the way. And in fact, pain is part of the plan, and we'll get to that as well. But the point is in a relative competition, you don't have to be perfect. You just have to be better than the team on the other side. Now, from the short-term pain perspective, doing something like what's going on now with Operation Epic Fury, it's going to disrupt global energy. And closing the Strait of Hormuz creates immediately supply constraints for the whole world. That's why we see oil at $90. And when oil prices spike, shipping costs soar, markets tremble. And listen, nobody's immune, especially the United States. We have a very consumer-based economy. And even though we produce a lot of energy, we use a lot of energy. So the US will be hurt on this as well. But when the US faces higher energy and higher goods prices, and the markets become volatile, the allies and other people around the world get strained as well. It's not that the cost isn't genuine. It is. It is. The pain is real. It's just that the US, from a big picture perspective, thinks it's okay to risk this and accepts this as a risk due to the potential upside. Because what else happens is when Gulf supply chains get severed, it's not just about energy. The US is one of the largest helium producers, but helium also is produced in the Middle East, and it gets shipped to Asia, and it hits Asian semiconductor industries. It also affects fertilizer flows. It threatens India's agricultural industry, and so it disrupts a lot of Asia because most of the oil and energy that goes through the Strait of Hormuz, about 80% of it goes to Asia. And while all of this is happening, Asian nations that built their entire industrial base on cheap Gulf energy suddenly faces an existential reckoning. And so again, while the US is getting hurt, they're not getting hurt in isolation. Um, because part of it is that the United States, many people forget this, the United States is the biggest oil producer in the world, and it's the number one liquid natural gas exporter in the world. Not only that, but for decades, the US was accused of, being beholden to cheap foreign oil. But all that time, they spent billions and billions and billions of money building up heavy crude refinery along the southern coast of the United States. Now, for a long time, people didn't think that was important. But now that global energy markets are fracturing, that is the perfect system to refine heavy crude. Now, who has heavy crude? Not really the Middle East. They have some, but most of the heavy crude is in Venezuela. It's in Mexico. It's in Canada. So when you have now a bifurcating global energy market, and you have the ability to refine the heavy crude that from some of the biggest oil reserves in the world, all of a sudden that doesn't look so stupid. And as I said, the helium leverage, that's a big one because it has to do with the chip design or chip manufacturing. And so, the fact that the helium exports from the Middle East to Asia gets disrupted, but the United States produces a lot of it, means Asia gets hurt worse than the United States. And again, the whole Venezuela thing, why do you think the United States went into Venezuela before setting their sights on Iran? That's not an accident, because if they control the Venezuelan oil fields, then that helps them control global energy flows, especially if global energy flows from the Gulf region gets cut off. And so it provides the possibility for the United States to be self-sufficient from an energy-based perspective, while the rest of the world is scrambling to get energy resources. Now, again, this doesn't mean it isn't painful. It doesn't mean it won't go perfectly. It doesn't mean that people won't get hurt, industries won't get affected. It just means on a relative basis, the US has an advantage that much of the rest of the world does not. Now, let's focus on these choke points a little bit, because in global energy, this is super important. And if you can control the waterways, then you can control the cost of energy, and that helps control the AI competition. You've probably heard me say over the last couple of either months or years, is that this big race with China, a lot of it has to do with the technological race, because whoever wins the technological race is going to build the technological architecture upon which the world is built for the next several decades. So it's a hugely important thing. And the most important input into AI is energy. So let's talk about the choke points of that energy that is needed to win that AI race. Well, obviously, in the Western Hemisphere, the Panama Canal is one of the most important waterways, and the United States kicked China out of that earlier this year, and they now control the Panama Canal. Also, the Red Sea is for the most part controlled on each side, because that accesses the Suez Canal. Energy flows, from the Middle East through there. The Strait of Hormuz is obviously extremely important. That is what's being, right next to the Iran, and that's what's being, contested right now. But when Lloyd's of London pulled out, the U.S. said they're going to go in, they're going to provide the insurance, they're going to provide Navy escorts, and does the U.S. perfectly control the Strait of Hormuz now? No, of course not yet, but they probably will when this is over. And even if they don't fully control it, they will control it better than anybody else. And if supply is still constrained in there, that just makes the energy produced in the Western Hemisphere more valuable. And then the Northern Sea Route is important as well. And that is what makes Greenland so important. And so that's not completely secured yet either, but that's in progress as well. But the point is if you zoom out and you figure out what the hell's why would the U.S. risk interfering with the global energy flow through the Strait of Hormuz? It's because the United States is one of the biggest energy producers in the world. And the price going up also, even though it hurts the U.S. from a consumer perspective, it helps the U.S. from a production perspective because they're selling at much higher prices, especially if the rest of the world's access to energy is compromised. So that's part of it, controlling the world's choke points. So what are the ultimate goals? Again, we know the risks. What are the ultimate goals? Well, obviously, they want to reshore semiconductors, right? If you can control the flow of energy out of the Middle East, that helps to control the manufacturing of semiconductors. You can also, the United States is the number one exporter of liquid natural gas. If supply and distribution is disrupted through the Middle East and the United States has all of this liquid natural gas that they can export, you can lock in long-term natural gas contracts. You can also, you can use the fact that the fertilizers and the energy flowing from the Strait of Hormuz is compromised and that most of it goes to Asia. You can use that to then negotiate with India regarding agriculture. You can also expand U.S. American oil sales. And then all of this contributes to energy and AI dominance. So those are the goals, and that's why it's so important. And, this area of the world is one of the most strategically, not just from an oil perspective, but from a geographic and commerce perspective or flow of commerce perspective. So what's the upside? Okay, so we know what the goals, we're willing to have some short-term pain. Part of the reason we're willing to have some short-term pain is because American resilience is probably a little bit higher than the rest of the world, and they have a number of advantages the rest of the world doesn't. So what's the third phase? What's this big upside that it's worth taking all this risk? Well, if you think about it, if nobody's going to fully control the Strait of Hormuz, but the United States has a better control of it than anywhere else, then you've basically got a permanent toll booth on one of the most important arteries in the world that controls energy. And the U.S. already has its eyes set on Karg Island, which is where a lot of Iranian production gets sold from. So if they can just control that island alone, that means Iran can no longer pay any of its bills. And can they cause problems? Can they cause disruption? Yeah, but they're not going to be the power they once were if the U.S. controls Karg Island and the Strait of Hormuz. So you've got this. And do you really think that when everything calms down, that Trump is going to give the insurance business back to the UK after the UK didn't even help them with this military operation? So again, that's another thing. It's not even on the list here, but the United States now basically has control of the insurance industry in that region once things do calm down. But again, set up a permanent toll booth in the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz. You control energy. You're locking in the AI supremacy. You have agricultural export dominance because the United States is not only is the United States a huge agricultural exporter, but now you also have control, or at least more control than anybody else, of fertilizers and methane and helium and stuff flowing out of the Middle East. Then you've got the Western Hemisphere energy monopoly. Again, you're the biggest liquid natural gas producer in the world. You now oversee, all of the oil from Venezuela and all of the oil from the United States. You're partnered with Canada and Mexico. And that then helps the manufacturing renaissance. And eventually, if it happens, the fact that they've now been negotiating with Greenland and the Arctic helps them control that as well. So again, it doesn't mean that all of this is going to happen. It doesn't mean that this is going to work perfectly. It doesn't mean there won't be setbacks. It doesn't mean part of it might blow up in the US's face, but this is the strategic upside. And if you zoom out, tell me who else has the potential to do any of this, or even anywhere near this amount of it. And so that's why it starts to get to be such a big deal. Now, the other thing I'd say is all of these, the idea that this has to go perfectly to work is silly. It's not. It is the only guarantee is this is not going to go perfectly. Nobody would plan on it going perfectly, and I would say only amateurs would expect it to go perfectly. Again, I would say pain is not the problem. Pain is the plan. Pain is the part of the process. They want there to be global chaos because in global chaos that provides the opportunity. So, this idea that things have to go perfect for it to work is just the wrong way to think about it. Plans never survive initial contact. It's that famous Mike Tyson quote, everybody has a plan until they get hit in the mouth. And, the idea that the no contingencies have been planned for is just, it's just totally naive. And the idea that, I don't even know for sure that the U.S. will definitely require a regime change. Now that they've killed the Ayatollah and his immediate successor, and so we'll see who comes in next. But again, it's more of a control of the energy than it is control of who's running the country. And the other thing is, the number of people who have said the U.S. didn't plan on energy is spiking, and that proves that the United States didn't know what they were doing. Well, okay. The idea that people on Twitter are able to see the second and third order effects of a military operation in the Middle East, and that the Pentagon, which is literally the largest logistic institution in the history of the world, had no idea that that would happen, or all these other second or third order effects would happen. It's just silly. They have whole rooms of people studying all of this stuff. Now, it doesn't mean that they understand it perfectly. It doesn't mean that they can, have a contingency plan that will work perfectly. It doesn't mean that none of this can, blow up back in the face. But the idea that they had no idea what they were getting into, and they thought this was going to be a cakewalk, and they have no plan for this to last more than a week or two. This is just naive thinking. So put that to the side and just think a little bit more critically about it. And then the other thing I'd say is a lot of times people say this is so arrogant that the U.S. thinks that they could pull this off. And again, I don't know that they can pull it off. Maybe they can't pull it off. Maybe they have overstepped. But the idea that these people that have risen to the top level of the military are all stupid people is just, listen, they may be misguided. They may be willing to do things that you don't think is right. They may not have all of the same, ethics and morals that you do, but these are not stupid people. And the idea that, when they go into black operations or they go into these lethal conflicts or they go into war, and that they don't understand unintended consequences or that they don't understand the need for contingency plans. It's not them that's being, if you think that's the case, then it's not them that's being arrogant. It's you that's being arrogant. And, a lot of these people that are in these positions, they have the equivalent of like 2 or 3 PhD level education by the time they have gotten to those spots. They study this constantly. So the idea that a couple people can, read a couple articles, in the Financial Times or The Economist, and all of a sudden they understand geopolitics of Middle East better than, the people that have been studying it their whole life. That's the arrogance. Now, again, this is not to say that the U.S. understands it perfectly. It's not to say that they don't make stupid mistakes. It's not to say that this is, that they can't get things wrong. But the idea that they have no idea what they're getting into, I think that is just a wrong way to think about it. And I think you're doing yourself a disservice if you underestimate their ability. But essentially, that's what's going on. That's the three phases. Short-term pain, U.S. resilience, and the idea is that you emerge from it with strategic upside that nobody else in the world. Leverage over other nations. When you want to control the choke points of global commerce, you want to be positioned for the AI race that is, kind of dominating everything right now. And at the end of the day, you want all of this to lead into or lead back to, returning, critical manufacturing functions to the United States so that it is no longer dependent upon, foreign nations. And again, I would highlight pain and chaos. That's the process. It's not the problem. It's not that it can't be a problem, and it's not that things won't go perfect or have to go perfectly, but pain and chaos is part of the process. So I think it's important to remember that. And then finally, I'd say, this guy, Richard Casey, I've interacted with him a lot. I've never actually met him, but he's pretty smart as well. And the competition is obviously China. And, many people will say, well, China's been trying to use their soft power to build up this bridge and road, initiative, throughout the Middle East, Africa, Europe, all over the world to try to counter the United States dominance. And you kind of got to ask yourself at this point, do you think Xi's starting to get worried about all of this money he's outlaid for the bridge and road when it's all just kind of now blowing up in his face as a result of U.S. hard power versus China's, soft power? And again, I think he said it very, very well here. He said, the Panama Canal or Greenland or Cuba or U.S. involvement in the drug cartels in Mexico and Ecuador and Venezuela. You can agree or disagree with the strategy, but to deny that these are all connected into some kind of a plan is a little bit ridiculous. And that's the point I would make. It's not that Trump has to be this grandmaster chess player. He might not even know how to play chess, but the people working with him certainly do. And again, underestimating their intelligence, I think, is a disservice. And you would have to be, I think, once you start to see all of these different dots, to think that they're not connected and that Trump is just waking up every morning, just making it up as he goes, and that there is no plan whatsoever, I think that is pretty naive. And I think Richard here said it about as good as anybody. So the last thing I'd say is other people will say, well, the U.S. no longer has the power to pull this off. Okay, let's just think about this for a second. In the last 18 months, not even 18 months yet, but let's just say in the last 18 months, the United States has renegotiated its ability to use Greenland as a strategic asset. They've taken back the Panama Canal from China. They've removed Maduro from power in Venezuela and now control the Venezuelan, oil fields. They've negotiated a deal to put U.S. troops down in Paraguay to fight corruption and terrorism because there's a lot of terrorist financing that goes on in Paraguay. They've told Europe that they have to spend 5% of their GDP on military upgrades. They've, in Diego Garcia, they've pushed back against Starmer, who wanted to give, the Diego Garcia back to Mauritius, and they have now launched a military operation in Iran. Now, here's the thing. Do I know that all of these things are going to go perfectly? No. But so far, nobody's been able to stop them. So that's power. When you can do all of these things and nobody can stop you, that's power. You don't have to like it. Doesn't mean it's a good thing, but that's a fact. All of these things have happened in the last 12 months. What other country has done anything like this? Now, again, it's not to say these are good things. It's just to say that they are. These are a fact of life, and that has impact on the global stage. And so that is where we're at today. And I think this is this new world we're in where hard power has made a comeback. So I think that's what's going on here. I think you don't have to believe that Trump is some grandmaster chess player to understand that there is a bigger game at play. And anyways, that's it for this week. If you like what we talked about here and you want to hear more about it, you can go to research.santiagocapital.com. We put out a number of different articles every month, and we make comments about topics that are related to what we talked about today. We kind of like to think about it as the intersection of financial markets, geopolitics, and the madness of crowds. So with all that said, we'll be back again next week and hope you guys all have a great week. Hi, I'm Brent Johnson with Santiago Capital. 4 months ago, we published Empire by Code and made a controversial claim. The US dollar stablecoins aren't just financial innovation. They're weapons of monetary power capable of extending the American hegemony without firing a single shot. The response was pretty intense. Some thought it was thought-provoking, others thought it was too conspiratorial, some thought it was ridiculous. But we continue to stand by the call. And since then, we have continued watching and we have continued researching. Because the empire isn't debating whether or not to expand. It's already expanding, right now, in real time. In Empire by Code, we also showed you why stablecoins matter, how $200 billion in tokenized dollars are already bypassing banks, eroding sovereignty, and making dollar access virtually unstoppable. We made the case that this is America's next great power move and tool to use on the global stage. But we left one question unanswered. Who controls it? Because while the United States will wield stablecoins as a strategic weapon, the battles to determine who gets to wield that weapon and which factions get to deploy it and under what rules are playing out right now. And the battles are brutal. In short, welcome to the stablecoin wars. These are actual conflicts with trillion-dollar stakes being fought on multiple fronts. Private issuers versus banks, regulators in civil war over jurisdiction, big tech plotting a return, nations resisting dollarization while their citizens have already voted with their wallets. The weapon exists, and the empire will use it. But the fight over the factions of who controls it is vicious, and most people have no idea it's even happening at all. So I'll give you a quick look into what's going on. Issuers generate billions in profit while traditional financial institutions are scrambling to launch competing coins before they become irrelevant. The SEC, CFTC, and Federal Reserve are fighting over jurisdiction, which creates chaos, which will ultimately determine which institutions get blessed and which ones get banned. In the yield battle, issuers earn billions investing reserves while paying nothing to customers. Who deserves that yield will determine who captures trillions in economic rents. And in the blockchain wars, Ethereum currently dominates stablecoin infrastructure, but Solana and Tron are fighting for the prize, which is to become essentially the settlement layer for the entire digital economy. And in emerging markets, countries like Venezuela, Argentina, Turkey, and Nigeria, citizens are abandoning their local currencies for US dollar stablecoins. Now, some countries will be able to manage this better than others, but others will collapse completely. And we also have stablecoins versus CBDCs. Central banks are building digital currencies to fight back, but markets have already chosen and have definitively chosen dollar stablecoins. Each of these battles shapes who holds power for the next century. This is much bigger than just stablecoins, and it's much bigger than just crypto. This is a battle for control of the base layer of global commerce. And when currency becomes software, whoever controls that infrastructure controls everything. Every transaction, every contract, every financial relationship. The winner writes the rules for how value moves for the next few generations. That's why the banks that ignored crypto are now scrambling. It's why China banned stablecoins while building the digital yuan. It's why these fights are so vicious. Because losing means irrelevance, while winning means power that exceeds Bretton Woods, the Eurodollar system, and the SWIFT network combined. But this time, it's encoded in software and distributed immediately on a global basis. As we said above, the stablecoin wars have already begun. The empire is expanding, but who controls it and holds the reins is still being decided in real time. We've mapped the battlefield, identified the players, analyzed what's at stake. The full paper we're putting out is called Stablecoin Wars, one battle after another. Be sure to read it, because the infrastructure being built today determines who holds power tomorrow. The question is whether or not people will understand what has happened before it's too late. And these battles will very much determine much of your financial future. Thanks for listening.